Welcome to IVF This, episode 34, Collateral Trauma. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I'm really excited to share this episode with all of you and really doing a deep dive into another aspect of trauma that I've been really thinking about. Before I do that, I want to remind everyone that I'm still doing free mini sessions. It's been a while since I talked about my mini sessions, but these are 30 minutes completely complimentary and dedicated to you. You come with something that you would like coaching on, and we just get straight to the point. A few examples of what I've covered in my mini sessions are processing emotions, which is a big thing, navigating all of the comments that people make, managing anxiety, mom guilt, and a slew of other examples. It really is designed to be a very targeted experience. You can find the link to schedule your mini session either on my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, or on my Instagram or Facebook profiles. If you have any questions or you're not sure about jumping on a call yet, shoot me an email at hello@ivfthiscoaching.com and you can ask me a question there. If you've listened to this podcast for any period of time, then you're going to be pretty familiar with my approach to coaching. So you really don't have anything to lose, except maybe the thing that's causing you pain and suffering right now. That's a pretty good deal. I want to get right into today's topic, which is collateral trauma. So this is an expansion from the original 2 episodes that we covered on trauma. So if you haven't listened to episode 5 and 6 of this podcast, I would strongly encourage you to do so. In those episodes, I really lay the groundwork on the trauma that surrounds infertility and another concept that I call compounded trauma, which is really how I view infertility trauma in a lot of ways. So you can check those episodes out, or if you haven't already, or again, if you're wanting a little bit of a refresher. Before I get into collateral trauma, I think it's important to kind of remind people that there are differences in trauma. There's what we call big T traumas and what we call little t traumas. I addressed this in the first 2 trauma episodes, but I think it bears repeating. Most people associate trauma with harrowing events like war, natural disaster, murder, etc. However, any distressing event that falls beyond the scope of normal human experience can be considered traumatic. Hello, that is infertility. Big T traumas are the traumas that are most commonly associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, and little t traumas are still traumatic, but they don't really fall into the big T category. It's most important to remember that there is no objective measure for what is and what is not trauma. Well, I suppose they can tell you, because people can say whatever they want, that it's not trauma, but it doesn't make them correct. So the concept that we're going to talk about today, which was actually developed by a coach mentor of mine named Karen Gillen. Now, she talked about it in reference to the workplace and how you can experience collateral trauma when you have terrible bosses and you're constantly feeling like you're in their wake. But I took that concept and I started thinking about how it could be applied within the context of infertility. Collateral trauma in infertility can look like maybe after a loss, going back into the doctor's office for even a routine scan, and you begin experiencing overwhelmed fear and anxiety. Now, I want to pause and remind everyone that not everything is trauma. We got to be really careful to not label everything as traumatic. And I'm also talking to myself when I say that, because recognizing trauma for what it is so essential for healing. But calling something trauma when it is what could be considered expected, quote unquote, anxiety is not necessarily beneficial to the person and can unnecessarily pathologize it for you. So when I'm talking about overwhelming fear or anxiety, I mean something that interferes with your daily life. Anxiety, fear, uncertainty is in a lot of ways an expected part of infertility or fertility treatments, but it's also an expected course of being just a human being. It's not a problem. When it interferes with your ability to function and you go to extremes to avoid it, you spend a lot of time preoccupied with it, those might be more signs of trauma. So I've got several clients who have experienced miscarriages, and they all talk about going to the doctor's office, even for routine scans, that it's very anxiety producing. Now, some of my clients, it's anxiety producing. They go in, it's uncomfortable to be sure, but it doesn't prevent them from doing the thing. But I also have clients that have actually delayed restarting a new cycle because in their minds, there's only one possible outcome for any scan, and that is devastating news. One of my clients says that when she goes into the office and the scan starts, she would begin uncontrollably crying. Those were her words. These are a few examples of what I believe could be considered collateral trauma. It's not the event that occurred that was traumatic, but it's kind of the residual fallout of the event. Walking into those exam rooms can be very difficult because they're often these same exam rooms where we've previously experienced terrible news. Another example I have from one of my clients is the retelling of stories. I have a client who experienced a miscarriage, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, she had a very large family gathering. This was one of the first since the pandemic, so it was the first time in over 15 months she was going to see her parents and other extended family members. We spoke prior to the event and kind of prepared her for some of the things that people might say or might ask. And then we spoke again after the get-together, and she talked about how difficult it was to navigate all the questions, even though we had kind of done our pre-homework. I don't know how many of you listening are Friends fans, but when Tom Selleck was a guest on the show and he eventually became one of Monica's love interests, he was newly divorced. In one of their first conversations that started his story arc was how people find out you're divorced and they'll kind of do this head tilt to the side and ask, "How are you doing?" And he would respond by nodding his head and saying, "I'm doing really well," or something like that. It's actually a very humorous aspect of Friends, but I think it really pertains to uncomfortable conversations that people have just in general. And this was the comparison that she was talking about. Well-intentioned, caring family members would come up to her, tilt their heads, and ask, "How are you holding up?" or "How are you feeling?" Then she would nod and say, "Hanging in there," or "I'm doing okay." And then afterwards, she would beat herself up because she wasn't really hanging in there, or at least that was her perception. And her perception was also that she wasn't doing okay. So she couldn't understand why she was answering that way. Now, these are incredibly common responses to these types of questions. Most of us respond, and this is what I told her, because number one, we don't really want to talk about whatever it is that's actually weighing on us. Two is we don't think that people actually want to know about the hard stuff, right? It's uncomfortable. Three, it's more polite, right? It's considered, I guess, more polite and easier for the conversations to just move along when we use those type of "I'm okay" or "I'm fine, I'm hanging in there." What usually happens is that we experience some sort of trauma response, which is exactly what happened to this client. Now, a trauma response is a normal reaction to abnormal events. And a trauma response is anything that our nervous system cannot process. I want you to think of trauma and trauma responses as like an electrical circuit. Imagine not being able to have the toaster and the microwave run at the same time. The system short circuits. It's turning itself off in order to protect itself. And that's what happened to my client at this family gathering when she was interacting with her family. She kind of shut that part of her brain off. I also like to think of trauma responses as like a fire suppression system. I remember being a kid and learning about fire safety. And one of the ways to stop a fire is to throw a blanket on top of it because it cuts off the fire's oxygen supply so the fire goes out. And that's what really happens in trauma responses. Your brain senses danger, aka fire or the trauma, and it throws a blanket over itself to put out the fire. There's nothing wrong with having trauma responses. In fact, it's actually a beautiful reminder that your brain is working exactly how it was designed. Several common trauma responses that I've seen in my clients and that are kind of textbook can include the need to feel busy and distract yourself. How many of us do this? Am I right? Oh, you can't see me, but I just raised my own hand, right? This is a fear-based distraction technique, so you won't be forced to acknowledge and feel what you would if you were to slow down. Oof, that one hits me hard. Another one is overthinking, which is a form of flight, fight or flight. Perfectionism. We think if we do everything perfectly, then we won't be judged and it'll all work out. Controlling behaviors. I have again raised my hand that you can't see, but we think if we can control things, then we will be safe. Like that's not a conscious thought, but unconsciously, control and safety are always inextricably linked. People pleasing is a big one, right? Getting locked into overwhelm, isolation, feeling numb, disassociation, explosive behavior, or angry outbursts. I mean, the list can go on and on. The most important thing you can do when you start to notice your trauma responses is to not make them mean something about you. A lot of my clients exhibit these behaviors and then make it mean that they're terrible people, that they aren't quote unquote handling things well, or that these behaviors are just part of who they are as a person, which isn't true. You aren't your behaviors. They're not part of your personality. What I want to impart on you is that the most helpful thing for you to know, besides what some of your trauma responses are, and I'm going to give you some journal prompts to dig into that, is what is too much. Knowing where your yeses and your nos live. There's a tremendous amount of social pressure for us to show up, right? To events, family gatherings, showers, weddings, even work. But often we show up to these things at the expense of ourselves, and it is too overwhelming. Offering to yourself that maybe you can sit this one out or just go to part of it. Maybe take a mental health day from work, just as you would if you had a cold or the flu. Really asking yourself, what is my yes and what is my no for this event or other events, activities, whatever. Knowing and understanding that your views might change depending on what is going on in your life and that is perfectly okay. Committing to going to a shower 3 weeks before your transfer only to find out that transfer failed, it's okay if you tell them, no, I'm not going to come. It's okay. Take that opportunity to be honest and true with yourself. What is going to be the best thing that will serve me in this moment? So I promised you some journal prompts to help you familiarize yourself with trauma responses, with your trauma responses. Okay. So the first one is going to be, what is your primary trauma response? Now you can get on Google, you can just Google trauma responses. There are so many, it would be an inexhaustive list for me to list them all, but you're going to know, like angry outbursts is a big one for me. Busying myself is a big one for me, right? What are your primary trauma responses? That's a great thing to journal on. Even if you don't look it up, just letting some free form ideas come out in your writing is going to be a beautiful way for you to kind of connect to yourself. What behaviors typically show up in a trauma response? So for me, I mentioned that I busy myself. So something that comes up a lot for me is this idea that I have to do all of these things, right? And I tell myself I have to do them, which feels terrible because then it almost eliminates a choice for me. And so then I kind of get frustrated, I get disheartened. It's a very dynamic and complex system. So really identifying behaviors, right? For me, it could be snapping at my kids. It could be snapping at my husband. It can be sitting at my computer, but not being productive, but telling myself I have all these things to do, right? All of those things. What is one behavior you'd like to change or address? When I started working and really looking at trauma responses, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on was when I raise my voice. Now, I can be a pretty loud person in general, but when I get a little bit heated, my voice, my volume will increase dramatically. And sometimes my volume is not linked to how I'm feeling. In other words, I can get very loud, but not necessarily be angry. And so one of the things that I really focused on was, how can I address that volume thing, right? Where people could interpret that what I'm saying is out of anger, but really that's not how I'm feeling. So like reconnecting with myself on that was a big part of one of the first things I wanted to address about myself. Another one is, what's one way to practice self-care after being triggered into a trauma response? Right? So let's say that you go to a doctor's appointment and from the moment you walk in, you just feel numb, right? Numbness, I mentioned earlier, is a trauma response. Now, I had someone I was doing a mini session with recently. She was talking about how when she feels numb, she actually makes that mean something about herself and her desire to have kids. She asked herself this question: what kind of person would want to bring a child into the world that they're not excited about? Right? Because she made that numbness, that trauma response that she was experiencing, mean something about her excitement about having children. But when we went back and I read back through some of the notes that I had taken when she was talking, she was really, really excited about bringing a tiny human into the world. She just wasn't recognizing that numbness was part of a coping mechanism that her brain had started, a trauma response that her brain was using to protect herself. Right? When she was able to do that and we were able to reframe what was happening, she didn't have to make it mean something about herself. So another one is, what support do you need during and after a trauma trigger? Now, a lot of this is going to be, what support can you offer yourself, right? Again, another practice of self-care, but also maybe including your partner in this or your best friend, right? Maybe someone that you can just talk to and ask them to reframe what could have happened. Ask them to remind you that trauma responses are a normal response to abnormal events. My best friend, I talk about a lot on this podcast, and one day I am going to have her on here just so you can hear how silly we are together. But she was talking about how she went to the post office one day and she just started crying. And then she remembered, as we were talking, she remembered it was the same post office she had gone to shortly after she had found out she was miscarrying, right? So at first she was making it mean that she was like this ridiculous person who can't control her feelings. But then once we were able to really kind of get underneath it, and she did all this work while like I was just listening. She was uncovering all of this herself, just having someone to listen to, but she was uncovering, oh yes, that was one of the first stops I made after leaving the doctor's office after finding out that I was miscarrying, right? So it's just about reframing, having someone to talk to out loud. And even if they don't respond, even if they aren't asking you questions, even if they aren't validating what's happening, just having a sounding board sometimes can be incredibly supportive. And one of the last ones, how does your trauma response impact your relationships? A lot about identifying behaviors that we don't want anymore, behaviors that don't serve us, come into play when we realize what those behaviors create for us in our lives. So if a trauma response is kind of angry outbursts, maybe that's something that you want to focus on because you don't like how it shows up in your relationships with your friends, your relationship with your partner, your relationship with your children, right? Maybe that is not how you want to show up in the world. And so that's something that you want to focus on. And all of these things that we can talk about during mini sessions. So I implore you, if this is something that you've struggled with or think that you're struggling with, or something that you're telling yourself that you're struggling with, go onto my website, click the mini session, and we can absolutely dig into this. I hope to hear from you very soon. And that is everything that I have for you today, my friends. Have a beautiful day. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.